Hello, and thanks for joining our webinar. I'm Shannon Sand, an Extension Agricultural Economist with Nebraska Extension and the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today is part of our center's weekly webinar series, which usually happens every Thursday at noon Central. You can check out the full schedule on our website at cap.unl.edu. For our fourth consecutive year, the all-land average value in Nebraska increased for the year ending February 1, 2023, to an average value of $3,835 per acre. That's about 14% higher than the prior year, according to the final results from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's 2023 Farm Real Estate Report. Today, we will take a look at cash rental rates and land values by region across the state, with a discussion of what factors have impacted those. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. To present, we are here with Jim Jansen, who is also an Extension Agricultural Economist with the Center for Ag Profitability at UNL. He is the co-author of the annual Real Estate Survey and Report, and today he will cover findings from the newly published final edition of this year's reports. Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Right. Thanks for hosting today, Shannon. So with today's webinar, what we'll be doing, we have about 45 minutes worth of material prepared. It's part of the prepared material at the end of today's recording. After the recording has been processed, we will be posting all slides presented on today. So there's no need to email me. I believe Ryan Evans, our media specialist, should be sending out a follow-up email to confirm when the material has been posted. And I would imagine probably within the next day or so, we'll get all those items sent. If you have other questions that you'd like to ask me, though, feel free to email me. My contact information is listed on the left-hand side of this slide. Jeffrey Stokes is our agricultural finance professor here at the University of Nebraska in the Department of Agricultural Economics. I wanted to give a thanks to ZAG Land out of Humphrey, Nebraska, ZAG Land. They are sponsoring today's webinar, and some of the proceeds from the sponsorship will help cover future mailings for the Farm Real Estate Survey. So they are the complete source of consulting. If you need help figuring out how to manage, lease analysis, some of those type of things, please feel free to reach out to sam at zag.ag. We really appreciate the help with covering the future costs of the land survey as we continue to perform this annual activity. Just be aware that today's information is based on a survey. The actual land values, actual cash rental rates may vary, keeping in mind an average is a representation on what might be representative of a certain geographic area. So first piece here, first thing to be aware, the annual survey, we do two different things each year. During the second week of March, typically around March 15th or so, we publish what is called the preliminary estimates. That takes a look at current estimated cash rental rates in addition to land values. And then the final report is published in June. It was published on the last day of June this year, but it was published on time. And as part of the final report, we publish all the preliminary estimate information, but we also publish the what we call the additional information on actual land sales. How are people financing long-term debt? Different grades of land, what are they estimated to be valued at? All the information presented on today is available via the Center for Ag Profitability website at cap.unl.edu/real estate. So please take a look at that. And if you have trouble finding it, you can contact us. Or also be aware many of the local county extension offices scattered across the state are more than happy to help you out when they are available outside of Fair Week. I know a lot of fairs are starting here in early July. So in the state of Nebraska, we have 93 counties, about a little less than 45 million acres of land. And with that land, we also have more irrigated cropland, and there's a couple different sources to look at, but I would say somewhere around 8 million acres of irrigated cropland in this state, about 22 million acres or 21.5 million acres of cropland total. So that includes the irrigated. And the remainder of the balance, around 22 to 23 million, is either in haying or grazing land. Given these unique attributes of the state of Nebraska, what we have done and what I believe we'll continue to do is we take the state and subdivide it into 8 different regions. These 8 different regions are called agricultural statistic districts, or more commonly, you might hear of crop reporting districts. Today we're broadcasting out of Lancaster County. Lancaster is home to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that would be in the East District. Buffalo and Hall County, so Kearney and Grand Island are in the central. North Platte would be in the southwest. Valentine would be in the north. Scottsbluff and Gearing, Alliance, Sydney, they're all in the northwest. Northeast would have Norfolk. The east would also have Columbus. And the southeast is home to Gage County. So I just picked out some of the larger communities across the state, but just be aware that how we subdivide the state is into regions. Each region has a lot of variability inside each county, let alone in each region. What we'll do today is we'll kind of start at the big picture, kind of start at the state of Nebraska, then we'll step down to the regions. We'll look at the regional cash rental rates later on, then down to the county. And then I'll give some farm level examples on how do we estimate a cash rental rate, given the current concerns, price expectations, yield, things of that nature. I'll provide some estimates to guide us through some examples on how do we set a cash rent. And just note, Ryan Evans, our media specialist on the chat, he shared with everyone the cap.unl.edu/real estate website. So if you click on that link during our presentation, it'll actually take you to the Center for Ag Profitability website, real estate webpage on it. All right, so first we'll start off kind of with we'll take a step back and look at the state of Nebraska briefly. What we did here on this slide is we take an average across all the different types of land in Nebraska, what is called the all land ag land value. And with the all land ag land value, each region, if you average all the different types of land, we come up with a statewide average as well. So if you average in the irrigated, dry land, grazing land, hay land, whatever the case is, and we estimated the overall statewide value was up about 14% year over year. Now on the market value of an asset, whether it's a car, a home, a farm, anything, the market value is always at a point in time. We estimate the point in time estimate as of February 1 of the current year compared to February 1st of the prior year. And just know that this number could be different throughout the year. Some years it changes a lot. Some years it might be very similar, or might be down slightly or up slightly. The market value is always a point in time estimate. So keep that in mind when you evaluate this information. This slide here, what we did, if you recalled on the bottom left-hand corner of the prior slide, we had the statewide all land ag land value. And with the statewide all land ag land value, we took the value since 1978, or the inception of the survey, and we took it all the way from 1978 to 2023. That's the blue line, and it's with respect to the value that we see on this side. Now, we also have the price of corn. You could use the price of wheat, soybeans, whatever the case is. But the value of what we have relates to the value of what we do. And if you kind of look back about 10 years ago, there might be somewhat of a lagged effect on what's happening currently with commodity prices relative to the market value of the asset. So if you get your crystal ball out and people ask me, what do I think is going to influence land values, or what are happening with the land values? Well, you know, when I put this slide together, maybe this price should be a little bit closer to $5 or slightly over, depending on your area. But nonetheless, commodity prices are down, not substantial. We didn't go from, $6.25 down to $3.25, but yes, prices are down to an extent. The expectation for commodity prices for new crops, so new crop corn, soybeans, things that we harvest after the crop matures this summer into this fall. So that would be one thing that might weigh down on the market value of land. And it's always hard to keep pushing that record price year over year. Over the last 2 years, the survey estimated the market value of ag land, all land ag land value, was up about 30%, 14% one year, 16% the other year. Let me go back here. Okay, I got off the slide. I apologize for that. Now on this next slide, what we did right here, the blue line is the all land ag land value again. So I know the prior slide that was kind of covering it up here a little bit, but up about 30% year over year, $3,835 an acre is where we're at in 2023. And the cost of borrowing, and I'm not suggesting you can go out and get a 20 or 30-year ag land loan for 4%. What I am suggesting is the T-bill rate or the treasury yield rate on a 10-year bond or 10-year T-bill, some folks call it. They have definitely trended up from where we were at the advent of the pandemic. Some of the numbers I've seen recently, 30-year ag land loan, 20 to 30 year, you might be talking in the low to mid 7%, which in the historical perspective, 7% in the 1980s would have been a very welcome thing. But compared to where we've been at, interest rates are trending a lot higher than we've been. It's been about a decade or so since we've seen some of these 7.5, maybe even 8% land loans. Operating debt, interest rates are up as well. And intermediate debt, things like if you go out and buy a tractor or other types of agricultural equipment, those rates are trending higher as well. So let's review what influences land. Market value of what we're doing on the property that's legally permissible. So the value of corn, soybeans, cattle, whatever we're raising, coupled with production expenses, and also the long-term cost borrowing. What's it cost to finance something? You want to go out and buy, if you're able to go out and buy a parcel of land, you have the available financing. All else equal, with the rising interest rates over time, rising interest rates tend to moderate, maybe slightly pull down the real estate markets, but they definitely are adding some weight on that. I don't know if we're going to see this thing exceed 4,000 an acre in the next year or two. Maybe we will. I have no idea, but fundamentals tend to support maybe a moderation in the real estate market. It's not to say there still aren't record-setting sales occurring right now, even, but overall, if you average it over time, we tend to see the interest rates be a long-term factor that tend to weigh down on the real estate market over time. So my prediction for 2024 is I don't know if we're going to be seeing these high rates of change. We might see a little bit gradual change from year to year going forward, unless we see exceptional commodity prices. And I could be wrong to say if we see corn jump to $7 a bushel, that'd be probably enough to offset these rising costs of borrowing for commodities across the state. And also cattle prices are much higher than they were a year ago. We're also facing challenging situations with drought and some of the things that come with that. A few things I wanted to review. First thing, if you're not aware, please make sure you take advantage of the state of Nebraska income tax credit for the state of Nebraska, the credit that's paid on your state income tax return. There's a refund available, and this was for the 2022 calendar year, and I know there'll be a revision for 23, but there's a rebate on a portion of the property taxes that are paid to the public school. And it was also a portion of the community college, and you'll see in the next slide some changes occurred. Just be aware there are people in the state that aren't taking advantage of this state of Nebraska income tax credit. This credit will apply to just not agricultural land, but if you own a residential home, doesn't matter the size of the community, you can get a small refund on a portion of the real estate taxes that help support public education or community colleges in your area of the state. Now, one new wrinkle to this program, and I haven't seen a lot of articles on this to kind of be able to digest it and put a slide together here. Be aware that the state of Nebraska, with the governor's office, issued this press release when this Property Tax Credit Act was enhanced or added to. But one of the legislative bills that were passed over the prior session here relates to the Property Tax Credit Act. And what this does is it's going to grow the amount that this prior credit that I mentioned on this prior slide here, how much this credit can be, it's going to enhance. So I mean, when I say enhance, it's going to increase how much state aid will be used to offset a portion of that local real estate tax that helps support the public school. There was a separate bill passed that adds additional aid to the public schools, K through 12 institutions. And also the state will be providing, they're going to be covering a portion of the real estate taxes that the local community colleges get for support from local ag land. So just know that there's going to be some reforms made. Go online and find some articles. This was just kind of a brief overview, but there are some caps put in place on the portion of the real estate tax, on how much the real estate tax portion that supports a local public school district can increase from year to year, and also how much that property tax and credit that I mentioned on the prior slide, how much that can grow from year to year. So just know that there's been some oversight put in place on how much the annual cap, with some exceptions. So the portion of the real estate tax that supports the K through 12, how fast that can grow. State aid will be directly covering, to my understanding, the local community college portion that comes from the real estate tax, and also put for some enhancements in that prior credit that was mentioned. I just want to briefly highlight, there are, I believe, 7 or 8 different types of land, or a land class that's found in the real estate report with these different types of land. So dry land, cropland, with and without irrigation potential, grazing land, non-tillable and tillable. We also have, trying to pull the other one, gravity irrigated, center pivot irrigated, as well as an overall statewide average. And I just want to highlight a few here. What we tend to see in the eastern part of the state, we've seen fairly similar rates of change. The western part, percentage-wise, we've seen a slightly higher change there, as well as in the South District. Central and Southwest, we also seen an increase as well in the North, a little bit more moderate. When it came to grazing land, what we call non-tillable, overall across the state of Nebraska, we've seen a rate of increase of about 15% overall. Some areas a little bit more, some areas a little bit less. But overall, if I would take my glass ball and estimate what land values are going to increase, well, one of the underlying fundamentals, we're seeing a lot higher prices for the prices of livestock, primarily cattle, that are raised on grazing land. But also keep in mind the cost of forage has gone up given the current concerns we have related to drought. So historically looking back, we've seen that the crop prices, the cropland land classes peaked first when we had the last major drought across the state. And then the grazing land classes tended to peak a year or two later. Maybe we might see something similar to that, I'm not sure. But just be aware that there's a difference when you talk about renting land to someone or from someone. Not all commodity prices increase or decrease at the same time. So you got to be aware of what you're renting and some of the major changes we're seeing there. Okay. Center pivot irrigated cropland across the state of Nebraska. We noted fairly strong gains in the east. The western part of the state, still, we've noted some moderate increases. The big question that we have this year is related to the area of the state where the property is being sold, or where you're an operator on, maybe renting ground. What type of water rights do you have in that area? Some areas might restrict the use of how much water you can apply during periods of exceptional drought, depending on the policies that guide that area. Every area of the state, obviously when it gets dry, there's a lot of concern about pumping of water, but there's slightly different standards or policies that guide the use of water. So that might also influence some of these prices that we're seeing for land sales reported across Nebraska, based on some of these underlying factors: the water availability, quality of the land, also how do the policies guide the use of that water. We asked the people that take the farm real estate survey, what are the current, what we call economic forces that are either leading to a decline or an increase? So if you see the line on this side of the chart, we see a decrease. And if we see the land on this side of the chart, we're seeing an increase. What do we notice? Well, okay, current livestock prices, current crop prices were still fairly bullish when the survey was done. The value of what we're producing is a favorable factor, a factor that might be feeding into some of the higher prices. What are some of the concerns that we have? Well, some of the concerns we have relate to things like property taxes, input expenses, and future property tax policies. How might this chart change? Well, where are the prices for these commodities growing? Where's the cost of interest rates and things of that nature? How are those things impacting the future of land? We'll have to see in 2024. But nonetheless, we still see somewhat from either no impact to somewhat positive for many of these economic forces. And we also see some concern based on the responses that were sent in. And to add a little bit more light, if you noticed in the prior slide, we mentioned fertilizer prices, or excuse me, farm input expenses were a concern placed by some folks on the future of farm real estate values. One thing I'll point out is I pulled from two different articles on DTN. They're based out of Omaha. We have that price of anhydrous, the price of potash. These were just happened to be the two that I could find this morning when I was putting the slide together. Everyone always asks me, well, when should I price my inputs? When's the best time to price these things? What is the price of fertilizer? Well, this is kind of like the farm real estate market. Depending upon the time of the year, it appears at least in 2021, there was definitely a cyclical appeal to the prices of fertilizer. And in 2022 here in green, it looks to me there might be some cyclical nature to those prices as well. Historically, there's a little seasonality in the prices, but trying to navigate these fertilizer prices in the last year or two, it looks to me, for example, on anhydrous, somebody should have probably prepaid last September, but then again, you waited until after the first of the year and things came down a little bit. It's hard to know when to price these things. So that's why setting the stage here to talk about cash rents, we need to have an equitable conversation on what do cash rental rates look like, just not the prices of what we're raising, the prices of the inputs related to those crops or cattle or whatever the case is. So fertilizer 2023 into 2024, it looks like things are trending down a little bit, especially on anhydrous. On the other side of the coin, it kind of leveled off a little bit, but just look from the first of the year to where we're at now. It's not dropped 50%, but there's been a pretty sizable change in this. So I encourage the operators that are joining us, or if you're someone that works with an operator, keep a keen eye on the fertilizer prices in your area. And when you see the appropriate decision that if prepaying would make sense, consider that if that's something that you'd like to do. The other question that comes up on interest rates, why might interest rates be weighing down on farm real estate values? Well, one of the big things is, and this came from the Kansas City Federal Reserve when they put out an article on May 24th, is the cost of borrowing. And this is interest rates for all types. So this would be operating, so like line of credit, intermediate debt, so things like a loan on a tractor, as well as long-term debt. So you might say something like a land loan, for example. And these are the different Federal Reserves here in the Midwest that kind of have a portfolio of ag operations. What do we see? Well, it appears to me that things during COVID really kind of bottomed out. And then starting in about 22, we've seen a gradual increase. In 23, we're seeing that the monetary effects of the Kansas City Federal Reserve are really starting to take effect now. So just be aware that with these rising interest rates, that trying to navigate these things, if you're asking all your cash rent upfront under the day of lease is signed, someone's having to borrow that money, having to pay all that cash rent upfront on the first day of the lease. That can be an expensive proposition if you're having to finance that or borrow the money to finance that cash rent. So just be aware, open lines of communication when we're dealing with some of these rising expenses. Okay. All right, so that concludes just a brief overview on what is happening to the market value of land. We talked about some of the fundamentals, some of my personal views. I guess we'll see what actually happens. It's anyone's guess what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months, but there are areas of the state that have been able to receive rain. There's quite a few areas that are quite dry right now. So keep an eye out, see what happens to commodity prices, cost of borrowing, and how those factors influence the value of land. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to start at the regional level, step down to the county, and then towards the end of these slides, we'll be giving some tips for farmland leases. And related to those farmland leases, how do we set a cash rental rate for 2023 or even 2024 if you're starting to think about that? First thing, the average reported. I know many folks have probably already set their cash rents for 2023. Think of this as a benchmark. How did your cash rents align with some of these numbers that we'll be discussing? Overall, in the state of Nebraska, we've seen cash rental rates were fairly steady. This is a percent change compared to 2022. So the eastern part of the state, we're in the single digits. Western part, we've seen some double digits. Just keep in mind, 10% of $30 is $3 versus say 10% on 265 is 26. So the magnitude of change is tied to the percent change relative to the base value. So keep that in mind when evaluating this information. In addition to the average, we have what is called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high third, average of the low third, and overall average. What do we notice? Well, what we notice on this slide is we give a breakdown here. And average of the high grade and average of the low grade really stand for that. The people that would take the survey, we ask them, what do you estimate the upper third of cash rent is in your area? What do you estimate the lower third of cash rent is? And what do you estimate your overall average is? When we call it the high grade and the low grade and the high grade, it's really the low third average and the high third average. Just be aware that we don't specifically define, okay, if you have high grade or high third average land in the central district, we're not specifying that it aligns with a certain yield or something to that nature. What influences the cash rental rates? Without a doubt, the quality of the land. You have some nice black soil. Is the soil you have, is it sandy? Is it a mix? Is it well drained? Is it a nice square field? Is it a field that has ditches or terraces? All those things influence the cash rental rates. Okay, in addition to that, another survey that's conducted is done by the USDA. There's a division in Lincoln here called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistic Service. Their survey is done traditionally in odd numbered years, and they happen to do it in 2022 as well. From what I've seen in the past, this information is usually published the second week of September. So the information I'm going to be talking on for 22 will be for 2022, not 2023. And if you go to this website, so after our meeting is done today, take out this link or take a screenshot while I'm talking on it here briefly. Go to this website right here and you can actually find this for yourself if you'd like. This survey is a survey of farmers and ranchers. The university surveys land industry professionals. So a slightly different pool of people. Why do I present the 2022 information if we're in 2023? One, I just want to make sure everyone is aware of it. What you'll notice in here, some of these counties are in white, especially out here in the Sandhills. If your county is in white, that means that there are not many people reporting on that particular type of land. There's not a lot of dryland cropland out in the Sandhills. There's not a lot of cropland in certain counties out there as well. And in the eastern part, we tend to see a lot more responses. Clay County, for example, there might be a lot more irrigated land there than dryland or non-irrigated cropland. So USDA by region or by district, this can give us some indication on, let's pick on the Northeast here, for example. It appears to me that some of these counties, say Wayne and Cumming County, might be more so in the upper third, maybe Boone and Antelope are in the lower third. What I mean by that is if you can kind of compare that against some of the rates that are published here, you can get some indications on how the cash rental rates vary around in the region. And that's one reason we publish these cash rental rates. Once again, this is for 2022. The 2023 update will be coming out, I believe, this map will be published. I know that raw numbers usually come out in late August, but the map itself will be published, I believe, in early August, or excuse me, early September, usually the second Friday. Switch gears here a little bit. The University of Nebraska reports irrigated cash rental rates for gravity in addition to center pivot rates. The irrigated rates assume that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. So we're talking the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. If the tenant provides one of those components, you might discount the cash rent to account for that. So what we'll be doing here is giving you some ideas towards the end of these slides on how to make those adjustments. But the breakdown that we have here across, I acknowledge there's certain areas we still have a fair amount of this type of land, some areas maybe not so much. In the central and east, there might be a little bit more gravity irrigated, especially along I-80 out here. What influence these rates? So all the things I mentioned about the productivity of the land, the competitiveness of the area, the configuration of the property. On irrigated cropland, water availability. Just because it's irrigated cropland, does that mean you're in an area you can irrigate as you seem appropriate, or is it an area where you might be turned off? Or the water appropriations from the irrigation districts out west here, they ended too soon, or they didn't have as much water as you had hoped for. If that's the case, you would have a situation where the cash rental rates, you would hopefully negotiate that in or include that as part of the discussion to set a rental rate that is what we might consider equitable or attainable given the expectations. The center pivot rates might be a little bit more common of a question that we tend to see across Nebraska. Then the northern districts, we're in the kind of mid single digits. Southern part, we've seen a little bit higher increase here in the south. Overall, for the state of Nebraska, once again, we have the average of the high third, low third, and overall average, or what we call the high grade and low grade. The breakdown that we see across Nebraska here can give us some indications on the quality of the land, water availability, market competitiveness, yield expectations. All these things pile into those cash rental rates that are paid. And especially with irrigated cropland using a pivot, some people ask me what influences the rates. Well, some of these rates are influenced by things like technology. If you have a smartphone or a computer that you can turn on or monitor the water use and water system with. So just be aware those factors all influence cash rental rates. The irrigated rates that the USDA produces, keep in mind if you're in an area where there's maybe not enough or a lot of irrigated cropland for enough acres to produce a survey estimate on those acres are in white. So that might be some of the cases in southeast Nebraska here. Or if you don't get enough people to respond to the survey, they don't provide an estimate. Also be aware that the USDA does not distinguish or pull apart the center pivot from the gravity or flood irrigated rates. Gravity or flood irrigated rates tend to rent maybe 30 to 50 bucks an acre on average, less than what center pivot does. With that being said, the cash rental rates that we have displayed here are a weighted average. They're weighted in proportion to the acres present in an area of the state that account for the center pivot as well as the gravity or flood irrigated averages. Switching gears here a little bit to the grazing land. Grazing land, a little bit, I would call the cash rental rates probably steady overall. Biggest concern that we're facing this year, especially on grazing land, is drought. How do you handle drought? And I'm aware there's areas of the state, I think out there in the southern panhandle or the southwest panhandle, I think there's been fairly adequate or much more favorable rain this year. Other parts of northeast, east, southeast Nebraska, it's dry. And I know there's been some rain that has come, but it's not a uniform rain across the state this year, unfortunately. So in addition to the average, once again, we have the average of the upper third, the high grade, average of the low third, low grade, and overall average. And these numbers that we have presented here, this is for the grazing land cash rental rate per acre. I'll present the monthly averages for cow-calf pairs in the next slide. Do I have to rent by the acre or the cow-calf pair? rent according to what the landlord and tenant can get along with. Some areas are very common to have one rate over the other or whatever the case is, and that's fine. Just be aware that at the end of the day, what is someone willing to write the check out for or willing to receive it for? Those are some of the things that influence the cash rental rates that we see across the state of Nebraska and the things that go with that. What influences cash rental rates besides the quality of the land and rainfall? The one thing that I would pose to people is maintaining of the fences, upkeep of the well or the water supply. With all these things, who's responsible for it? Alan Vanalik, when he was here and we go out and do meetings together, we always joked, it's always the other party. Well, it's probably going to come down to the people that have the time, skill set, and ability that are willing to do some of these things. So that's just a breakdown of the cash rental rate. What I would say when it comes to grazing land is what are the parties willing and able to agree upon. That's what some of the things that influences the cash rental rates on grazing land. And per acre rates that the USDA publishes are on this slide right here. This is for the traditional summer grazing season. If you're out in the ranching areas where they might graze off season, early in the spring, late in the fall or winter, you might adjust those rates accordingly. And the university also reports the monthly cow-calf pair rental rate. So this is one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. Keep in mind these averages. If you're renting for a 5-month period, you would take the monthly rate. So let's pick on the lower third average in the Southwest here, for example. On the lower third average, if you take 50 times 5, that would be about 250 a pair, lower third average. Yeah, obviously some of these other numbers, I just picked on 50 because that's 50 times 5 is 250. That's a little bit easier to find. But even 60 is basically 60 here, but 60 times 5 would be 300. All the factors I mentioned for cropland related to the productivity, market competitiveness definitely influence grazing land, in addition to some of the other upkeep and maintenance, weed control, fences, thistles, noxious weeds, brush, anything that's unwanted on that site, all influences the cash rental rate that's paid. If an operator is willing to do some of these things for the landlord, maybe you would have a lower cash rental rate to reflect some of those factors. If you have a property that has problems, I encourage everyone, instead of just forgetting about them, if you have a tenant that has the equipment, a skid steer with a shredder on it or something to go out there and you can shred trees with it, that's great. As a landlord, are you willing to take a lower cash rental rate to account for that individual's time? Or if you don't want to do it that way, will you reimburse that tenant for that individual's time and use of the equipment and diesel and wear and tear? A lot of these pieces of equipment that are used to control brush and that, first of all, they're not cheap to buy. Secondly, they have a lot of wear and tear on them and they cost a lot to operate. It's not a fast process. You just don't do shred an acre of trees in 10 minutes. Well, you do if there's just 1 or 2 trees on it. If you truly have a lot of issues, think about how do we improve this property so it's better than from when we initially bought it or inherited it. Okay, so now we're switching gears here a little bit to 2023 and talk about trends and leases for 2023 and give us some ideas. We kind of started with the state of Nebraska, looking at some of these line charts, looking at some of the trends nationally for input expenses or whatever the case is. Let's talk about some farm level expenses. Let's try to drive it down to the farm. So we have 3 different ways to figure out cash rental rates. I'd like to focus on the first 2, and I think these might be some good examples for folks that are joining us today, regardless if you're a landlord or tenant or banker or whoever you might be. How do we figure out a cash rental rate that makes sense? Here's a few ideas. First idea, we have a situation where we looked at the USDA map, and I try to pick different numbers throughout these because I know there's no one uniform cash rental rate. And this might be an example of irrigated corn out in western Nebraska or dryland corn in eastern Nebraska, for example. Let's just say your regional cash rental rate's $190 an acre. If you take 190 divided by 134, that gives us what we call the county rent per bushel. All that says is on rented land in this particular example, $1.42 of what is it going towards? $1.42 of the sale price of that crop on that rented land is going towards the cash rental rate. It's $1.42 a bushel, a lot of money when the price of corn is $6. It's not too bad. What about when the price of corn is $3.20 or $2.80? A little bit different deal then. So if we take that county rent per bushel, $1.42 per bushel, and slide it up to the right-hand corner, the county yield was 134 bushel. My farm level yield is 119. If I take the county rent per bushel times the average yield, that gives us what we call the farm level cash rent. We adjust what we know for the county down to what we're not exactly certain on, the regional estimate for the farm. $1.42 times 119 bushel per acre, that gives us the farm level cash rent. Another example I set up here, and I just pulled some numbers, and these numbers are probably not the same for everyone. So what I did here was, let's say we have a field. It's going to produce 160 bushel, and I acknowledge this is a drought year. And out in the western part of the state, maybe this is more closer aligned with irrigated ground, for example. But last March, when that lease was signed, we thought, based on the planting time price guarantee average from crop insurance, we thought price of corn was going to be about $5.91 a bushel. Let's call it $5.90, doesn't matter. And based on our budget for the year, we anticipated if the landlord had to pay half the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses, that's what they would pay traditionally on a 50-50 lease, crop share lease, and they probably pay half of the energy expenses, electricity or diesel if it was an irrigated lease. But on this dryland example, if the landlord gets half the crop minus half of the production expenses of that seed, fertilizer, and chemical, we usually split those on a 50-50 lease. The difference between us, that gives us what is called the net return to the owner, or what they would make per acre, or what a tenant might suggest. Okay, if I gave you, let's say, $250 or $260 an acre, would that be a cash rent that makes sense? Well, it'd be a cash rental rate that would be reflective of the productivity, the yield, in price, in addition to the expenses. Well, we get to July, and if you've been watching the new crop corn prices, maybe we're here in July, we've seen a little bit of a run up for this fall, but this number is probably a little too high even. But price of corn was only $5.25 a bushel. Does that mean our prices of our inputs are going to go down? Absolutely not. They're still going to stay constant. And then you get to this fall, and this was the price of corn within the last day or two when I made this slide for Columbus, Nebraska, at the ADM plant there. It's kind of one of the major markets here in the northeast part of the state. Once again, this just goes to show us, well, what is the cash rental rate that makes sense? Well, it's probably a cash rental rate that makes sense based on what the actual yields and prices and input expenses are. And this is just one way to estimate the cash rental rate using cash equivalent from crop share. What's the opportunity value on the ground if you don't do a crop share? A cash lease. So as a landlord or a land tenant, if you're trying to make an offer on cash rent, or someone has asked you or offered you or asked you for a certain number, take that number and start working backwards. Does it make sense? Does the other party truly understand what the yield potential is? Things of that nature. And for those folks that are setting cash rents on hayland, this has been a popular question our offices have been getting. Let's say we have a property that's suffering from drought and it only yields 1.5 tons per acre on hay. And according to the hay prices I've seen this morning, hay prices on grass hay, for good quality grass hay, definitely trending higher. The difference between the income minus the expenses on this slide give us some ideas on the cash rent. This should be $89.10 an acre on the income. But this just goes to show you, if you're, depending on the type of share you're doing, 3367 or a 50-50 lease, the difference between the income minus the expenses are one way to estimate. And you'll notice on the 50-50 split on the footnote here, the landlord pays for, let's say, half the fertilizer, went through some expensive nitrogen fertilizer, or maybe you paid for half the fertilizer and you had to do some spraying out there because there were weeds or whatever the case is. But once again, this is one way to estimate. And when I updated this example, we used to use 2.5 tons or 2 tons, I forget the exact number, but I backed it down this year because of how dry it was. But at the same time, prices were a little bit higher for hay. And finally, example, this is kind of an example that bankers might be a little bit more aware of. You know the market value of the land, you multiply it by the rate of return, which in the rate of return is in table 5 of the Farm Real Estate Report. Market value times the rate of return gives us the rental rate per acre. You have to be very careful on when you identify the market value. You have to be very careful on the actual market value that's being used. Few highlights from our 2023 survey this year. Who is actually responsible for maintaining the irrigation equipment as part of the lease? What we found, about half the time it's the landlord and the tenant. About 30% of the time the tenant just takes care of everything, basic upkeep that is, and the other remainder of the time it's someone else or the landlord just takes care of everything. If I have a lease arrangement where the landlord does not own the pivot, the tenant provides the pivot, meaning they take care of the pivot, they insure it, pay tax on it if they have to. How much do you take off the cash rental rate to account for the fact that the tenant is the one providing the pivot? About half the time that discounts somewhere between 26 to 50, a little more than a third of the time it's about 10 to 25, remainder of the balance it's around 51 or greater, and very small portion take anything off. Truly account for the cost of the pivot. Pivots are not cheap improvements given the cost of steel right now. And the final thing I wanted to highlight here, when it comes to the power unit, so let's say the tenant provides a diesel, propane engine, or natural electric motor, propane or natural gas engine. If that's the case, how much should the cash rental rate be to account, or how much should you take off the cash rental rate to account for that? Well, about a third of the time, roughly, let's pick on the electric motor. If the tenant provides electric motor, sometimes a third of the time the discount's either between 1 to 9 or 10 to 20. Based on our phone calls that we get in the extension offices, I would say 10 to 15 is a pretty common number that we tend to see. So if the tenant's providing the diesel engine, but the landlord owns everything else, about a third of the time you take off one of these two discounts. With it being noted, there are cases where they don't take anything off. There are cases when they take even more off. If you do not have a lease in writing, we highly encourage you to get one in writing. Great resource for that is aglease101.org. aglease101.org. Please take a look at it. If you don't have a lease in writing, please get one in writing. I also want to thank ZAG Land for their sponsorship today to help cover the cost of future land management survey efforts that we do here at the university. Please reach out to Sam if you find him useful. And also the other thing that we always like to point out, the survey itself, it is expensive based on the thousands of surveys that get sent out. If you would like to help support, this is a free service. I don't use the word free very often. This is a service that is not at cost. If you'd like to log on and look at these numbers on the future, get a printout from an extension office, they don't cost anything to the general public. They're covered by internal funding here at the university, which has been somewhat tight in recent years. So we encourage you, if there's anyone that would like to help out with this, please reach out to Barbara over at the NU Foundation. And we're also trying to start an endowment for this. So if there's any businesses out there that'd like to make a donation, please visit with Barbara. We have a handful of land management outreach meetings coming up. We're trying to pilot some new workshops. You'll notice that some of these meetings that are over the lunch hour are actually going to have a free lunch that's included with them. And a couple locations we'll just be doing a local meeting. Please call the local extension office and confirm location details and make sure we have enough people and enough handouts if we do these meetings. So just be aware, these meetings are coming up. We also have one scheduled in September, and I think we might even have one out at North Platte. We haven't set the details on that yet. These are what we call pilot meetings, where we're trying some new topics to see if there's interest in the public. And we plan to do a full series across the state of Nebraska this upcoming winter. Panhandle, Southwest, Southeast, Northeast, North Central. So please reach out to your local extension office. And the other thing we have coming up is called Ag Land Management Quarterly. We have one scheduled for August 21st. Dive a little bit deeper into cash rental rates, but we'll highlight some of this information we talked about today. But also we'll be highlighting some of these lease communications. I think I might get Alan Vanelli to help us out one more time. We might have someone hired on the eastern part of the state to work with on the land management. So stay tuned for that. But and once again, you'll have an area to submit questions if you have any questions. So please reach out if you have any questions for that and consider joining us then. And if you got any questions, now it's going to be the Q&A time. And I see Shannon turned her camera back on, so there must be a few questions. And we'll try to highlight those with the time permitting that's allowed. And I got 10 minutes left. If you got additional questions, type them in and we'll go ahead and get started. So Shannon, take it away.
Okay. So I guess my question is, do you want the one that I think is going to take the longest, or do you want the shortest day?
Just start from the first and head on.
Okay.
I'm looking at them now.
All right, sounds good. So the first question is, there's a large discrepancy between farm values used by county assessors for property taxes, 75% of fair market value, and the UNL real estate survey values. Could you explain a little bit about the differences and why there is that difference?
Yes. When we talk about the market value of an asset, we're talking about it, the estimated market value at a point in time. We estimated it as of February 1. If you have to get an appraisal done because you're getting a loan or you inherited land and you have to do an appraisal to settle the estate, maybe that appraised value was the day of the prior owner's passing. Assessed value in Nebraska is based off of state of Nebraska law. The definition of assessment is defined by the state of Nebraska. And there are different definitions of value. There's federal definitions of value. My understanding on ag land, it's a 3-year. So you look at typically, let's say in a township or a representation area for a county commissioner or a representative like a county supervisor, they look at the last 3 years of sales. So, okay, if you look at the last 3 years, they're going to have a list of comparable properties, and they're going to pick what is called the median, or the number in the middle. So based on the assessed value might be a little bit more conservative in the years when you see market values increasing over time, because you're looking at the last 3 years of sales, and you're also picking that median number. And they're using 75%, as that person noted as well.
Okay, that makes sense. So, and then we have, does the percent of return include property taxes as an expense?
Yeah, so the question on the rate of return, and if you have additional questions, please type them into the Q&A pane. I can go for a few minutes after 1 o'clock. The example I provided today is based on the gross rate of return. If you recall that prior slide, and I can go over to it here quick.
Yeah.
This is the gross, excuse me, I had to go back a few more. Here we go. Right here. I use the gross rate of return.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between the gross and net rate of return would include land ownership expense, with that biggest expense being property taxes. We estimate what is called the net rate of return, estimated net rate of return in table 5. And the real estate taxes, I would estimate, might shave off anywhere from 1/10 to 1/3% on the rate of return, maybe even more than that, from where it's at.
Okay. Sounds good. When you rent dry land, does rent include land that is fallow for that season?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question to answer. And also another question we see sometimes is, should we rent based on the total number of acres in the parcel, or should we rent based on the what we call the tillable acres?
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense.
I'll answer the first question I posed, and then I'll try to answer the second question that was typed in.
Okay.
Related to the first question, in my view, we tend to see what is actually utilizable acres, or what we call the tillable acres. Now, if you have a property that has a grass perimeter that you can cut for hay or something, charge a different rate for that. You don't need to charge the full cash rent if you're on irrigated cropland, for example. So I tend to see it's based, I know you pay real estate taxes on the total number of acres, but we tend to see cash rent paid on what we call the tillable acres, in my view.
Right.
Now, when it comes to fallow land, for those folks that may not know, in certain parts, primarily in the western part of the state, to conserve moisture, you might let a property sit idle. And if you let that sit idle, the idea being moisture gets worked back into the ground. Well, if you're not farming a property or a portion of the property for 1 year, should we still be charging the full cash rent? I've seen people handle this one of two ways. Way one, they charge a lower rate across the total number of acres, keeping in mind some acres are going to be farmed, some acres are going to be set aside and basically just inactive, not inactive, but going to be set idle for the year. Or I've seen cases where you charge a more market going rate for the actual acres that are being utilized, and the acres that aren't being utilized on the fallow side. If there's basically no value to the tenant that year with respect to being able to graze it or hay it or farm it, you may not charge a cash rental rate. So either charge maybe a lower cash rent on all acres, or charge the market prevailing rate on the acres you're actually using. And then on some of this fallow ground, if you get into this stuff where it's you're doing like winter wheat or another crop that overwinters, rye, for example, it gets a little bit more tricky. You kind of look at a rolling average in that way. Go ahead. Anything else, Shannon?
That makes sense. I'm just waiting to see if we have anything else. I think that might be it.
I'm going to highlight once more again.
Okay.
If anyone would like to make a donation, more than welcome to make one there. Anything goes directly towards the cost of printing a mailing survey in the future. And keep in mind, if you're joining us, hopefully some of you can make a trip to join us in one of these locations. And we're actually doing a meeting at the Douglas Sarpy. I believe it's I think there's a Sarpy County Extension office now too, but it is the Douglas County Extension office. So be sure, if anyone has an interest, join us for that. We haven't done a meeting there in a couple of years. So I hope that we can get a crowd of people for that meeting.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Looks like that was our last question. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu, where you can also register for other upcoming webinars. And we would also really appreciate your feedback on the brief evaluation that should pop up when you exit Zoom. It helps tell us how today went and inform us of future webinars. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jim.